The most famous fact about Antarctica is that you have heard 1,000 times that it's the most isolated, most pristine, most untouched continent on Earth, that nothing lives beneath the ice except microbes, that no human activity happens there beyond research stations. But any scientist who works in the deep drilling programs will tell you that this pristine narrative is an illusion. It hides more than it reveals. It merges comfortable public statements with classified findings and becomes a mystery wrapped in international silence. We look at the maps and see just a frozen wasteland, but if you look deeper, if you dig through the classified drilling reports instead of empty ice, we will find discoveries that governments agreed to never discuss publicly. Today, we will look beneath the surface and find what military intelligence tried to bury in the protocols of international treaties. We will see structures that shouldn't exist under 2 miles of ancient ice. We will find out how ordinary drilling missions encountered chambers that made geologists call the Pentagon. We will discover the ecosystem that survives in conditions that defy every known law of biology. And we will understand why some drill sites are literally forbidden zones with coordinates that have been erased from public records.
This continent is not just frozen wilderness, it is a gigantic locked vault, the contents of which governments begin to acknowledge only when secrecy becomes impossible. In the early 2000s, when Russian scientists began to breach the final meters toward Lake Vostok, they faced a problem that put both geologists and military officials in a stupor. They had to explain why a drilling operation that was supposed to reach a pristine subglacial lake kept encountering anomalies that didn't match any natural formation. They brought international observers, magnetic resonance imaging, and classification protocols, thinking that the lake would be simple. Water, maybe bacteria. Case closed. This lake was more than 15 million years old, but when they analyzed the magnetic readings, the conductivity signatures, the geometric patterns, nothing made sense for a natural body of water. They mapped every anomaly, measured every inconsistent reading, documented every impossible finding. The results contradicted everything. The lake wasn't just isolated, it was structured. The researchers were shocked. They expected a sterile environment, perhaps some extremophile bacteria, but the data behaved differently. The more precisely they measured, the more deliberate the pattern seemed. It appeared that something beneath Lake Vostok wasn't natural geology, it was organized. As if nature hadn't created this, as if something had built it, or something was living in conditions that should kill everything.
Of course, when preliminary findings leaked to the press, conspiracy theorists immediately seized the story. People were convinced that the Russians had found a Nazi base, or an alien outpost, or a portal to another dimension. They said that secret Nazi expeditions in the 1930s had discovered warm caves and built new Schwabenland, or that extraterrestrials had crashed there millions of years ago. The origin of this mystery was mixed with theories that blamed everyone from time travelers to ancient civilizations, or those who came from the stars. How could geometric structures exist 2 miles under ice that's been frozen for millions of years? It's just a contradiction to basic geology. But the answer was found not by conspiracy theorists, but by microbiologists. And it was not in science fiction, but in extremophile biology. Scientists from multiple nations took samples from the drill hole and analyzed them through every known method. The result forced them to classify the findings immediately. The secret they found beneath Lake Vostok was life. Not just life, but an entire ecosystem that shouldn't exist. Organisms thriving at -3 degrees Celsius in water that's been isolated for 15 million years. From the point of view of biology, this was impossible. Complete darkness, no photosynthesis, crushing pressure, near freezing temperatures, isolation from Earth's surface longer than humans have existed. Yet DNA analysis revealed thousands of species. Bacteria that metabolize sulfur, fungi that survive radiation, organisms with genetic codes never seen before. This subglacial biosphere had properties that contradict known biology. The organisms weren't related to anything on Earth's surface. They were evolutionary orphans, developing in total isolation since before the Ice Age. It turned out that beneath Antarctica exists a parallel biosphere, completely unknown to science, potentially representing what early Earth was like, or what alien life might resemble. So Lake Vostok is essentially the most alien environment on Earth without leaving the planet. But if strange biology was shocking, then the next discovery made scientists demand immediate military classification. And what they found in the lake's magnetic signature made them believe they'd encountered something impossible. Any geophysicist who studies Lake Vostok's surveys will tell you about the anomaly. The water itself has normal magnetic properties. Ice has predictable magnetic behavior. But beneath the southern end of the lake, the magnetic readings spike.
Something massive is down there that's magnetically active. When they mapped it with ice-penetrating radar, they saw a structure, roughly cylindrical, approximately 5 miles long, buried in sediment beneath the lake. People watching the data come in couldn't explain it. Natural formations don't create magnetic anomalies this precise. Mineral deposits don't form perfect cylinders, and nothing biological generates magnetic fields this strong. The scientists filed classification requests within hours. Intelligence agencies decided to investigate before any papers were published. They reviewed every scan, every measurement, every data point collected from the drilling operation. And the intelligence conclusion was clear, but disturbing. We don't know what it is. And it's not about scientific uncertainty, but about strategic ambiguity. Any analyst will tell you that when governments classify natural discoveries, it's because the findings have military implications, or because they're genuinely inexplicable, and admitting ignorance is dangerous. The magnetic anomaly didn't breach security because it was alien. It was classified because no one could explain it, and unexplained meant unpredictable. But it doesn't mean the research stopped. More drilling happened, more data collected, more findings that never appeared in public journals. The international community agreed. Lake Vostok's contents would remain classified until a unified explanation could be presented. So the anomaly is real. The data exists, but the interpretation remains locked behind national security protocols. But if Lake Vostok's magnetic mystery was classified, then in East Antarctica they discovered something that made classification inevitable. There they found structures that seem impossible even to mention in scientific papers. When we say Antarctica, the image appears of ice, snow, and research stations. This is the picture that documentaries show. But if you access the classified radar surveys, if you see the ice-penetrating imaging from military satellites, this comfortable image shatters. There are no random geological features, no simple subglacial mountains, and no explanation that satisfies physics. There are geometric patterns, straight lines running for miles beneath the ice, right angles in bedrock that nature doesn't create, pyramid-shaped formations perfectly aligned with cardinal directions, and they've been buried there for at least 12 million years.
Researchers who first processed these radar images often didn't understand what they were seeing. They saw patterns that looked artificial, structures that resembled construction, formations that appeared designed rather than geological. They thought the equipment was malfunctioning, that ice crystals were creating false echoes. But if you run the scans again, if you use different frequencies and multiple satellite passes, you can see that the patterns are consistent. Nature doesn't repeat geometric precision across hundreds of square miles. This discovery in East Antarctica is real controversy. It looks like it should require ancient civilizations, advanced pre-ice construction, or something non-human. Yet in fact, these formations have been frozen since before modern humans evolved. They're older than human civilization by millions of years. And the most incredible thing is what they're made of. Researchers have been analyzing the radar signatures for decades, trying to determine composition without drilling. After all, how can you have geometric structures in bedrock that predate the ice? Rock doesn't form in straight lines. Mountains don't create right angles. Erosion doesn't produce pyramid shapes with mathematical precision. People were convinced that the readings were sensor artifacts, that atmospheric conditions were distorting the radar, which doesn't allow for simple geological explanations. The solution to this mystery shocked military strategists with its implications. The researchers were in a situation where they had to explain structures that couldn't be natural but couldn't be artificial either. And they proposed a hypothesis that remains classified but has leaked through academic backchannels. These aren't buildings. They're geological formations, shaped by unique tectonic processes that occurred before Antarctica froze. But there was one element that made this explanation unsatisfying: precision. The angles are too exact, the alignments too perfect, the repetition too organized. It turned out to be geological processes that, if natural, reveal physics we don't understand, or artificial structures from a time when nothing intelligent should have existed on Earth. This discovery survived classification precisely because both explanations are destabilizing. Natural means our geology is incomplete. Artificial means our history is wrong. Until recently, governments and scientists considered these radar anomalies to be embarrassing outliers. It seemed that the only solution was to avoid discussing them publicly. Researchers accessing the data see them and file classification requests. Documentaries about Antarctica carefully frame shots to avoid showing the specific coordinates. This comfortable silence was maintained until satellite technology improved to the point where independent researchers could access similar data. And when commercial satellites with ice-penetrating capabilities became available, the geometric structures were rediscovered by civilian scientists. This completely turned the classification strategy upside down. The structures were not hidden through suppression. They were hidden through misdirection and denial. When researchers looked at the patterns, they saw formations that demanded explanation. Some proposed ancient impact craters with unusual erosion. Others suggested volcanic activity creating false patterns.
But none of the explanations matched all the data. The structures remain in classified databases, acknowledged privately, denied publicly, and thoroughly unexplained. This discovery showed how easily inconvenient findings disappear into security protocols, not because they're dangerous, but because they're inexplicable. But there are mysteries beneath Antarctica that governments can't classify, because nature itself revealed them in ways that couldn't be hidden. Some secrets of the continent exist in places where classification is impossible. Look at the blood falls of Taylor Glacier. You will see iron-rich water pouring from the glacier face, staining the ice blood red. For decades, scientists and tourists looked at this phenomenon with fascination. The water is red because of oxidized iron. Simple chemistry, natural process, nothing unusual. Except the water is coming from a sealed system that's been isolated for 2 million years. In 2009, a team of microbiologists analyzed the blood falls more carefully. They wanted to understand the ecosystem. The plan was simple: take samples, culture the bacteria, study their metabolism. This seemed like an interesting extremophile research project. The microbiologists' equipment was ready. But as soon as they sequenced the DNA and analyzed the metabolic pathways, they realized they'd found something extraordinary. It turned out that the organisms in the blood falls ecosystem are surviving without oxygen, without light, and without connection to Earth's subsurface biosphere for millions of years. They're metabolizing sulfur and iron in complete darkness. They represent a form of life that evolved independently from everything else on the planet. These microorganisms worked as proof that life doesn't need the conditions we consider essential, and nature created them by accident. With invisible chemistry, they were surviving in conditions that should be sterile.
creating an ecosystem based on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. They literally demonstrated that Earth harbors alien-like life in its own basement. Moreover, these organisms were producing energy through chemical reactions that don't occur anywhere else on the planet. They were using metabolic pathways that had never been documented. It protected them from extinction when Antarctica froze. It also demonstrated that life is far more resilient, far more creative, and far more weird than biology textbooks suggest. Without this Antarctic isolation, we would still think life requires sunlight, warmth, and oxygen. But now we know better. The bloodfalls became proof that life finds ways we can't imagine. This discovery completely overturned assumptions about habitability around the world. Now, astrobiologists study Antarctica's subglacial systems as models for potential life on Europa, Enceladus, and other ice-covered moons. Any attempt to define life's requirements is now considered premature. But if bloodfalls revealed alien-like biochemistry, then the next discovery showed that Antarctica once had conditions we'd never have predicted.
And what paleontologists found in the transantarctic mountains remains one of the most surreal findings in geological history. Let's move on to 2016. You're a paleontologist working in the transantarctic mountains. There is only ice, rock, and the expectation of finding maybe some fossilized marine organisms from when this area was underwater. You're cataloging rock samples in a region that's been frozen for millions of years. You split open a rock expecting nothing unusual, and inside, you find a forest. Not fossilized wood, not petrified trees, but preserved leaves, branches, and root systems that look like they died yesterday. In the Arctic at that time, finding plant fossils would be unusual but explainable. But in Antarctica, in rock that dates to 280 million years ago, the implications are staggering. Antarctica wasn't always frozen. We knew that. But the preservation is so perfect that the cell structures are intact. You can see individual cells under a microscope. The fossils contain photosynthetic tissues that are still chemically identifiable. These aren't the usual stone impressions that fossils create. These are actual biological materials, preserved in a way that shouldn't survive 280 million years. The paleontologists examining these samples couldn't believe the condition. They tested for contamination. They verified the dating. They checked if somehow modern plant material had infiltrated the samples. But the analysis was clear. These are genuine Permian-era plants, preserved so perfectly that you could theoretically extract DNA if the molecules hadn't degraded over hundreds of millions of years. The forests of ancient Antarctica looked like modern temperate forests. Massive trees, thick undergrowth, a complete ecosystem thriving in a place that's now the harshest environment on Earth. The climate shift that turned this forest into an ice sheet was so catastrophic, so rapid, that the biological material didn't have time to fully decay before being entombed. This rapid preservation created time capsules of impossible quality. The forests didn't rot, they froze mid-existence. And now, hundreds of millions of years later, we're finding them and realizing that Antarctica's past is more Earth-like, more habitable, more biologically rich than any frozen wasteland should be. But the forests raise a terrifying question. If Antarctica could transform from forest to ice sheet, what's to stop other continents from doing the same? The mechanisms that froze Antarctica could potentially freeze anywhere. Climate is less stable than we assume. The comfortable belief that continents stay in their climate zones is false. Antarctica is proof that radical change happens fast, and leaves almost nothing alive. So, when scientists study these forests, they're not just looking at the past, they're seeing a warning about Earth's climate volatility.
They're understanding that the world we know is temporary, balanced on conditions that can shift within lifetimes. The forests survived as fossils because the cold preserved them. But the ecosystems, the animals, the entire biosphere of warm Antarctica? Gone. Erased so completely that we only discovered it existed by accident. And if it happened there, it can happen anywhere. The forests are beautiful discoveries, but they're also monuments to extinction. But if ancient forests show Antarctica's past,
Then in the modern era, they discovered something that reveals the continent's active instability. And what glaciologists found beneath the Thwaites Glacier made them classify the findings not for security, but for public panic prevention. Until recently, scientists considered the Antarctic ice sheet to be stable on human timescales. It seemed that, sure, the edges might melt a little, but the interior would remain frozen for millennia. This comfortable assumption was considered scientific consensus. Tourists visit Antarctica and see solid ice. Climate models predicted slow change. Governments planned policy around stable Antarctica. Then, in 2019, researchers sent a robot beneath the Thwaites Glacier, the so-called Doomsday Glacier, because its collapse would raise sea levels catastrophically. And when the robot sent back video, the scientists went silent. They weren't looking at solid ice anchored to bedrock. They were looking at cavities, massive voids beneath the glacier where warm ocean water was circulating, melting the ice from below. The glacier wasn't resting on rock, it was floating on water, held in place by friction and pressure, but fundamentally unstable. The voids were huge, some as tall as the Eiffel Tower, extending for miles, and the warm water was eating away at the ice, weakening the glacier's grip. The implications hit immediately. Thwaites could collapse not in centuries, but in decades, maybe faster. When one researcher calculated the sea level rise if Thwaites failed completely, he said the number out loud and everyone in the room fell silent. 3 meters, 10 feet, enough to submerge Miami, New York's financial district, London's Thames barrier, Shanghai's coast. Hundreds of millions of people would be displaced. The global economic damage would be incalculable. So, the findings were published. You can't classify geological data from international research, but the full implications, the worst-case scenarios, the rapid collapse models, those remain in internal reports that governments share but don't publicize. Because if the public understood how unstable Antarctica really is, how close we are to triggering irreversible collapse, the panic would be immediate. The truth about Thwaites isn't classified, it's just carefully managed.
Scientists publish papers about increased melt rates and concern about glacier stability. They don't publish headlines that say, major city flooding possible within 20 years. They don't show the models where Thwaites fails, triggering the collapse of adjacent glaciers, creating a cascade that raises oceans by 10 meters or more. That data exists, it's just not in the press releases. Antarctica isn't passively frozen, it's actively melting from below, in places we can't see, in ways that are accelerating. And by the time the surface shows obvious collapse, it will be far too late to stop. This is what historians call the paradox of Antarctic research. You can discover the most destabilizing findings in science, measure the precise timelines of catastrophic change, and document the mechanisms that will flood coastlines worldwide. But all of it becomes useless if the political and economic systems can't handle the truth. The Thwaites data was published, but the implications were softened, qualified, presented as one possibility among many, when internally glaciologists know it's not if, but when. The robot footage of those massive voids should have been front-page news worldwide. Instead, it appeared in scientific journals, discussed in careful academic language, stripped of urgency. Because urgency creates panic, and panic creates political pressure that governments aren't ready to handle. So the glacier melts, the data accumulates, and the warnings get published in places where the public doesn't read them. We started our journey with the comfortable myth that Antarctica is pristine, stable, and understood, and ended up with a truth that is much more complicated and disturbing than any ice documentary admits. We saw that Antarctica is not just a frozen continent, slowly revealing its past. This is an active enigma. This is microbiology, where isolated ecosystems evolve alien-like survival in perpetual darkness. This is classified magnetism, where Lake Vostok's depths hide structures that defy explanation. This is geometric bedrock, where radar reveals patterns that shouldn't exist in natural formations.
This is ancient forests, where 280-million-year-old trees warn us that continents can freeze overnight. This is melting instability, where glaciers collapse from within while we watch the surface. But the most important discovery we made today concerns not the ice, but the silence. Antarctica, buried and mysterious and partially classified, eventually became a symbol that terrifies everyone who truly understands it. Every year, thousands of researchers of different nations, languages, and beliefs work in the frozen South. They study these mysteries and feel the same thing. They tremble before how little we know and how much remains hidden. The continent did not fulfill its role as simple research territory. Climate models failed, geological assumptions shattered, biological rules broke. But it fulfilled a purpose no one intended. It preserved questions that force us to admit our ignorance. Questions about what's beneath the ice. Questions about what lives in impossible conditions. Questions about what happens when continents freeze. Questions about what happens when they melt. And perhaps, standing at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf and looking at the blank white horizon, we should think neither about alien bases, nor ancient civilizations, nor secret Nazi bunkers. We have to think that even our most confident understanding of Earth will always be challenged by places we can't fully access. And this is probably the most important lesson that Antarctica teaches us. That the most dangerous mysteries aren't the ones we've solved wrong. They're the ones we're not allowed to study at all. That classification exists not just to hide military secrets, but to hide the terrifying truth that we don't understand our own planet as well as we pretend.